This first chart shows total bankruptcy cases filed nationwide from 1990 through 2015. And you can see there's been a real roller coaster in filings during that time. Back in 1996 was the first time that filings actually reached 1 million a year. From 2000 through 2004, we were up over 1.5 million per year. 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, filings went over 2 million and then dropped 70% the next year. That was followed by 4 years of rapid rises where filings got back up to over 1.5 million, and we're pretty much at the pre-reform levels. And then for the last 5 years, filings have been dropping down and are now at the about the same level as the early 1990s. Chapter by chapter, this shows the same thing for by chapter, and you can see in the left the total filings. The top right in the red is Chapter 7s. Chapter 7s are about 70% of total bankruptcy filings, and that pretty much determines the total filings chart. The spike in filings in 2005 before reform was very much a phenomenon of Chapter 7. There wasn't very much for 11s or 13s. And you see that down on the bottom left in the green, the Chapter 11s actually peaked in 2009 with the recession and have been dropping since then, although they leveled out in 2015. And Chapter 13s have been generally more stable, but have followed the same upward pattern through early 2000s, a drop-off in 2006, rise through the recession, and then a decline in recent years. Now, trying to determine what the impact of BAP-CPRA or the bankruptcy reform was, certainly it has had some impact on, a permanent impact on filing levels, and that they are considerably lower now than they would have been without the legislation. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. It's hard to pin down any particular one as the culprit, but the cost is higher. There's new requirements such as credit counseling, and we know that 10 to 15% of people who get credit counseling certificates end up not filing. The means test, the requirement to show their tax returns, the possibility of audits, limits on discharges, limits on repeat filings, additional paperwork, and just overall public perception. That all this has caused a permanent reduction in bankruptcies relative to what they would have been. Now, there's two other factors that need to be considered when you're looking at the impact of bankruptcy reform. The first is the Great Recession. The official dates for that were December '07 to June of 2009, but it really, was felt for several years after that in the bankruptcy courts. And also in the financial markets. The stock market went down about 50%. Home prices dropped 32%. Household wealth was down 19%. And unemployment reached nearly 10%. And there were big increases in foreclosures, delinquencies, distressed sales. And so it really was a very major event in all our lives, and it had an effect on what happened with bankruptcies during 2008 to 2011 or 12 or so. A second factor to consider is the change in consumer debt. This chart shows three major components of consumer debt: student loans, auto loans, and credit card debt. And you can see that student loans have gone up, nearly tripled in the last 10 years. Auto loans are up 36%, and credit card debt is, about the same over that time. The student loan debt, which, and it's really, 1.26 billion here is, that's as high as the national debt was in 1982. So, that's a large number. But generally that's not dischargeable in bankruptcy. And so, we've seen, all the growth in consumer debt has been in debt that doesn't go away in bankruptcy. If another way to look at this is looking at debt that is delinquent over 90 days by amount, and you can see that the red is credit card debt, and that spiked. Was much higher for credit cards than auto or student loan back in 2005. It spiked during the recession, and it's dropped down. It's fallen nearly in half in the last 5 or 6 years. Auto debt or delinquent auto debt is up slightly over the last 10 years, but the real growth is with student loan delinquencies, which are nearly 6 times as high now as what they were 10 years ago, and much higher relative to than credit card or student loan debt. So putting all this together, taking into account the recession, which would have caused filings to spike, and the changing debt profile of consumers, which would have limited filings, I've attempted to figure out, if you look at this chart, the red lines are what I think bankruptcies would have been without bankruptcy reform. And the yellow is the area, those are the cases that have kind of gone away as a result of bankruptcy reform in 2005. And it's somewhere in the 5 to 6 million cases, missing cases, or nearly all these would be Chapter 7s, people that didn't file that probably would have filed if the law hadn't been changed. Now, if we look at the trends by state, and this chart shows, compares the annual average of filings from 2004, the period just before reform, to annual filings for the last 10 years afterwards. And overall, there's been a 27% decline in filings, which is kind of unprecedented. In the past, filings would almost always go up decade over decade. But there are a few places in the red where the decline has been over 50%. Only 2 states have had an actual increase over pre-reform levels, that's California and Colorado. And blue is kind of the predominant color, so between 25 and 50% decline for most states. Let's see, the one thing that is clear in here is that the decline has been a little bit lower in the states that were hit hardest by the recession. That would particularly be Florida, California, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, I think are probably the main ones there. Okay, this next chart shows the filing trends by quarter, the percent change from year to year. And typically in the past, and, going back to really 1900, when filings go down about 1/3 of the time, but the typical filing decline is lasts from 1.5 to 3 years, and the total decline from the peak is between 10 and 20%. This one has been going on 5.5 years now, and for a lot of this time, the decline has been over 10%, into the 15% range. The first quarter of 2016, the decline was only 5%, which is the lowest since 2010. So I think there are signs that filings might actually start to edge up to pretty soon. Another thing to keep in mind is that Chapter 7, Chapter 13 cases have a little different trajectory, and particularly the Chapter 7 filings are more volatile. When they're going up, they go up faster than the 13s. The 7s on here are the red columns, and the blue line is Chapter 13s, and that is always closer to the zero axis there, is that they don't go up as fast, they don't go down as fast. And right now you can also see that in first quarter 2016, Chapter 13s actually went up a little bit nationwide. And if we look at just this last quarter, and it may be too early to tell in some places, but on this map, red shows an increase. And there are a number of states where bankruptcies are now starting to rise, although at fairly low rate, and only a few states left that are having fairly significant declines of over 10%. and those would be in the white there. But overall, I figured that about 1 out of 8 adults in the United States have filed for bankruptcy sometime, at least once in their lifetime. And the way I figured this was that about 1/3 of filings are joint filings, where you've got basically 2 people filed, and then you try to take out the repeat filings, the business filings, and dead debtors. The filings relative to population, there's some real differences by state there, and particularly the Southeast, where you have a lot of Chapter 13 cases, have a much higher rate. Traditionally, the filing rate has been very low in the Northeast. Tennessee has been kind of the perennial leader in bankruptcies, and their filing rate is about double the national average. And Alaska has been the lowest, where they're only at about 40% of the national average. One other national trend to look at is the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s. This has been fairly stable for 30 years until 2005, 2007. There were real disruptions with bankruptcy reform. And then in recent years, that number has been edging up, mainly because of just that 7s have been going down more than 13s. Regarding Chapter 11s, the trend has been somewhat down over time. The 3 peaks that we have in this chart correspond with the most recent recessions. And in 2015, though, filings seem to have bottomed out and went up just slightly last year, and will be going up even more this year. On this chart, the red aspect of it are what are considered the non-business cases, and those were higher in the early 90s before the Chapter 13 debt limits were increased. And then you can also see that the red portion is a little bit higher in the most recent recession, where you had a lot of homeowners ended up with Chapter 13. And then one last thing to look at is the very large Chapter 11 cases, and these very much correspond with the recessions. A large number of these cases are filed in either Southern District of New York, New York City, or Delaware. And in 2015, we did see an increase in large cases, and that's continuing. It's even more so this year. There's been 17 so far filed in this year, mostly energy or energy related, the oil and gas cases, and probably we'll get about 40 large cases this year, so that'll be quite a bit more than usual. So that's what's been going on nationwide.